artist noticed that the skin tones are varied. There are light brown skinned people and very dark brown to jet black. This is an accurate representation of how skin complexion varies in Africa. So this is part 3 of our series about the ethnicity of the ancient Egyptians. In the previous parts, we looked at some ancient statues and paintings depicting the ancient Egyptians. In there, we already saw that most representations showed typically black African features, which led us to conclude that though there were other ethnicities to be found in ancient Egypt, the majority and founding ethnicity was Black African. To further support this, I bring to you a set of representations of the peoples neighboring ancient Egypt, such as the ancient Greeks, the Romans, the Semites, and the Nubians. We are especially going to focus on the Nubians, since ancient Egypt considered Nubia to be a sister civilization. So without wasting more time, let's start comparing. Certain scholars argue that ancient Egyptians had no notion of race, that is, a notion of race that resembles our modern one. That view is simply not true, since there are multiple depictions found on ancient Egyptian tomb paintings representing the 4 types of humankind known to men, and other scholars agree to this. However, they use it to demonstrate that ancient Egyptians were a red race of some sort, unrelated to any people around it. But this view simply does not stand, given the evidence at hand, as we shall see further in this video. Other scholars hold the view that ancient Egyptians were similar to North African peoples, i.e. the Berbers, who in turn look similar to Middle Eastern peoples and Mediterranean peoples. Well, let's see if this view also stands the test of the archaeological evidence. So as I was saying earlier, the ancient Egyptians were clearly aware of race. Look at this picture. They represented these people. I believe these people are people from the Middle East. You can clearly see here they represented the Nubians with different features and a different skin tone. They were clearly aware of race. So this myth that the ancient Egyptians did not see race the way we do today is what it is. It is a myth, because as you can see here, they clearly saw the differences in skin tone, hair texture, way of dressing, mannerisms that we see today in various peoples of the world. So this is a reconstruction of the types of men. So these would be the 4 races of men that the ancient Egyptians knew at the time. This is a reconstruction. The original is from this wall. As you can see, the wall is pretty much damaged, but you can still tell that these are not Egyptians. These are a different people. First, I want us to have a look at how ancient populations around Egypt represented themselves. So let's begin with the Mesopotamian peoples. These would be Assyrians, or let's just say the Semitic type. The ancestors of the Syrians, the Arabs, the people from the Middle East, basically. So this is an image from Assyria, ancient Iraq. Pay attention to the way these people are represented. If the ancient Egyptians were indeed the same as these people, they would have represented their features in a very, very similar way. But here we can see the striking differences. Pay attention to the lips. They are not full. The nose is pretty characteristic of the nose you find in Arabia today or the Middle East. Very large nose from the profile view, right? And pretty aquiline. And look at the hair. Again, this is a silky hair texture. You can tell it's silky. Another representation from the Middle East. This is again Assyria. Look at the beards. Ancient Egyptians, remember, rarely showed themselves with beards, and I believe the beards that they are shown with are fake beards, because they believed having hair on your body was unpure. The only hair you were supposed to have was just the hair on your head, not a beard. That was unpure. So again, we have here a striking difference between ancient Egyptian iconography and that of the Assyrians, the Middle Eastern peoples. They're supposedly supposed to look like. Pay attention to the features here. Again, very thin lips, not full, not as full as that of the Africans, right? The nose as well is very telling. The shape of the face, you can tell this is a Middle Eastern man. Again, here we have a painting from ancient Mesopotamia, full beard, very similar to this man here. The hair texture is very telling. This is a silky hair texture resembling that of the Arabs today. Again, this is a Sumerian god, I believe, right? So as you can see here, the features are again very different from Egyptian gods who had full lips, a flat nose, and if you pay attention to the shape of the head from a profile view, the profile of the ancient Egyptian head was always protruding at the level of the mouth. In other terms, it's known as prognatism. But you can see here that prognatism is completely gone. We do not see it. And it's normal because this is a Middle Eastern man, the ancestor of the Arabic man, the Syrian man, the Iraqi man. This is their ancestors and he represents them. Next, we have the Greeks, a Mediterranean peoples. Okay, so there is a theory out there that says the ancient Egyptians were Mediterranean people, so they would have looked like the Greeks or the Romans or the Middle Eastern peoples. Again, pay attention to how the Greeks represented themselves. All right, so if these were the same peoples, you would find similarities such as the hair texture, the facial features, but that's not what we find in ancient Egyptian iconography. We find for the Greeks silky hair. This is the typical hair of the European, the Southern European. Even his beard is silky. And pay attention to the lips here, they are non-existent, right? Pay attention to the lips here. They are not full at all. You can clearly see that the upper lip is going inward instead of outward as you would find in the Africans. This is a European. You can tell, the statue tells you. And how do you know without the skin color? You can tell that because the features are telling you that. The nose is telling you that. The lack of prognatism at the level of the mouth, as with many Europeans, it's very telling. Again, a Greek man here, not at all similar to the ancient Egyptian. This is an ancient Greek woman. Pay attention to the profile view of her face. The prognatism is non-existent. The nose is very aquiline, not flat as that of the ancient Egyptian statues. The hair, again here, is a very different hairstyle for one. The texture is depicted as silky. We can tell this is silky hair, not braided, no locks, nothing like that. We can tell this is a white woman from Southern Europe. Again, very different from the depiction of ancient Egyptian women on statues. We'll compare that later. Here is another ancient Greek male. Pay attention to his hair texture, his nose. The hair texture is very silky. The nose is very aquiline and protruding forward instead of being flat like that of the ancient Egyptian statues. The lips are again not full, typical of the Southern European people and even most European peoples, and I would even extend that to the Middle Eastern people. They do not have full lips. The typical Middle Eastern person does not have full lips. The typical European person does not have full lips. As we can see here, that's what the Greeks represented. These are features that were typical in ancient Greece, and so they represented it in their iconography. Right there we have ancient Greek pottery art. Very beautiful. Again, pay attention to the profile view of the Greek man here. Very straight. It's very straight. The nose is the one that protrudes outward, but the mouth is inward, typical of the European profile. Very vertical here, especially at the level of the mouth. Very different from ancient Egyptian iconography, especially when it comes to paintings. Right, and this is to me a very telling statue. This is an ancient Egyptian official of the Ptolemaic period being represented. Here we have a Greek man. This is not a native Egyptian. It's a Greek man. It's a Greek official who was appointed at some place in Egypt to oversee the affairs of his king. So as you can see here, you can note the features are all of a sudden very different, but these are the same artists of ancient Egypt representing their official, but the features have changed. Look at the lips, not full. Why? Because this is a Greek man. If all the ancient Egyptians were white or Middle Eastern, they would have represented on their statues the features typical of the Middle Eastern men or the Mediterranean peoples, but this is not the case. The hair texture, very telling again. silky hair texture, not the same hair texture that you find on other ancient Egyptian statues. This is very telling. This is a very telling piece of evidence. This shows you that the ancient Egyptian artists were very keen on representing features accurately. So next, we're going to look at Romans. Ancient Romans. Ancient Romans is pretty much the same with Greeks, right? The Romans basically copied what the Greeks were doing with their statues and they started representing themselves. Since these are the same peoples, right? They are both Southern European peoples, so they represent themselves the same way. And since the Romans took a lot of Greek culture and implanted it in their own culture, it only makes sense to find a lot of statues of Romans that look very similar to that of the Greeks. They are basically the same statues, actually. Look at this Roman prince, I would guess. This is a reconstruction, a pretty accurate one. No one would deny this reconstruction because the features present on the statues tell us that this was a Southern European white male. The hair texture tells us that. The nose tells us that. The lips tell us that. So again, very telling. Pay attention to his lips. Pretty small, not full at all. For most ancient Roman and ancient Greek statues, the lips are not full. The nose is pretty aquiline, not flat and broad. And the hair is always silky. So if these people were the ancient Egyptians, it would stand to reason that they would have represented themselves in a very similar way. The changes would not be so dramatic, right? You change the whole hair texture, you change the whole facial features. Now, that does not make sense. Next, we're going to look at Nubia. Another neighbor of ancient Egypt, a very close neighbor. They interacted a lot with the Nubians. Ancient Egyptians and the Nubians interacted a lot. Wars, trade, all that you want, religion, everything. They interacted so much together. Here is a pharaoh of the 25th dynasty, a pharaoh from Nubia. These are the so-called black pharaohs. Again, pay attention to how he is represented compared to this Greek official who was represented by Egyptian artists. Notice that this is a white male. So his hair texture is different, his facial features are different. But when they represent an African man, a Nubian, pay attention to the lips. All of a sudden, they become full again. The nose is flatter, the mouth is protruding, the nose is flat, and you can clearly see this is a black male. Here is another representation of a Nubian. I do not know where this one is from, but it's from ancient times. Pay attention to the way he's represented. His lips are full, his nose is flat. This is a typical black male. Pay attention to his hair texture. Again, curls all over his head. Here is a Nubian tomb. The similarities are striking with ancient Egyptian tombs. It's pretty telling. If I hadn't told you that this was a Nubian tomb, you would have thought this was an Egyptian tomb because the hieroglyphics are there, the iconography is the same so-called red-brown skin is found here. This is brown again, people. This is brown. I just want to call it red-brown, but it's brown. Alright, so these are Nubians again, clearly black people representing themselves with a light brown color and using the same iconography that the Egyptians used, the same writing system, the same rituals for burial that ancient Egyptians used. So we find more similarities here than with the other groups, such as the Middle Easterners and the Greeks, the Mediterranean peoples. And this is a bonus. This is how Africans further south, such as the West Africans and Bantus, represent themselves on statues. Again, you can see here they have a prognatism. They have full lips. The nose is flat. This is the head of a prince at Ele Ife. This is the head of a princess of Ele Ife. Again, full lips, prognatism, flat nose, typical black woman. Features very similar to that on the statues of the ancient Egyptians. Now let's compare, let's put some pictures together so that you can do the comparison yourselves. I like that. I like people to see the comparisons for themselves and try to explain why the same people, the supposedly same people, would represent themselves in so very different ways in terms of features and everything. So remember this picture, this is Seti the First and his wife. Brown skin, full lips, again zoom in, full lips, flat nose, and you can tell there is a prognatism. Their profile shows prognatism. Remember the Greek profile? Right, it does not resemble this at all. Pay attention to the Middle Eastern profile as well on this Assyrian ancient man. Pay attention to his profile view. The prognatism is gone. The nose is very different from that of the ancient Egyptian depiction. So we can clearly see these are not the same peoples. This is not the same people being represented. The features are very different. Again, look at the hair texture. Look at that of Seti the first. The hair texture is very different. Next, we have the Egyptian males and females. Males being represented with different skin tones there, with afros, full lips, prognatism around the lips there. Compare them to the Ahamushu people. This is a group of Western Asian people. So these would be probably the Jews or the Semitic people, right? Something like that. Very different from the ancient Egyptians, right? The nose is very telling. The ancients noticed that the nose of these people is very protruding, like it's really aquiline and it protrudes. And you can see this in many Arab men. Arabic men have this very protruding nose, and you can find that in Armenians. Armenians have a very protruding nose too, and these are their ancestors. Here we have the ancient Egyptian foot soldiers, wooden statues painted in brown, dark brown. Again, compare these to the Nubian soldiers. The hair texture is the same, very similar hairstyles. The skin tone, again, you can compare this skin tone to, let's say, Jay-Z and Akon together. Jay-Z and Akon. Jay-Z is lighter than Akon, and Akon is pretty dark compared to Jay-Z. Pay attention to the features. The features do not lie. The features are pretty much the same. Flat nose, full lips, afro hair, and the prognatism. Same for the Nubians. Flat nose, full lips, prognatism, afro hair. This is just a darker black man, and this is just a lighter brown black male. Now, compare this ancient Egyptian princess. This is one of the daughters of Akhenaten. Pay attention to her features. She looks very much like an Ethiopian woman. Compare this princess to this Greek woman. I wish we had hair on this princess, but Akhenaten artists were very weird. They just chose a whole new different style. But even when they chose the whole new different style, they still chose to represent the nose very similarly to that of the Africans. The lips are again very full, and the prognatism is still very much present. But compare it to the Greek woman, the prognatism is gone. The nose is very aquiline, pretty straight, right? The hair is very silky. Right, this is a princess from Ele-Ife. Again, the prognatism is there, the nose is there, flat, pretty similar to that of the princess here. The lips are very telling, it's pretty much the same way that they're presented. Here is a Nubian tomb. Nubian tomb, again, I already talked about this. Compare it to the Egyptian tomb. The similarities are striking. Can anybody explain why these two peoples that are not supposed to be the same people represent everything in a very similar way, draw themselves in a very similar way, represent themselves in a very similar way, and that's vice versa, but somehow they're not the same? And these people that do not remotely represent themselves similarly to the ancient Egyptians are supposedly the ancient Egyptians. It does not make sense. Compare this ancient Egyptian statue of Amenhotep III and this ancient Egyptian head of an official during the Ptolemaic period. The Ptolemaic period is when the Greeks took over Egypt. This is Amenhotep III. This is when the native Egyptians were still ruling themselves. This is Amenhotep III. Clearly a black male with full lips, flat nose, afro hair texture on top there. This is hair being represented. It's not a headdress. It's not a hat. This is hair. I know a lot of people, I know a lot of experts out there are like, this is not hair. But if you look at the Amasunzu hairstyle from the Rwandese people, it's just the same hairstyle that you find on Egyptian pharaohs. Again, look at the hair texture difference. The texture is very different. The features are very different. This one has full lips. This one does not, because this one was a white man and this one was a black male from Africa. Then we have the head of Pharaoh Shabaka. This is a Nubian pharaoh. He came from Nubia with the 25th dynasty. Again, look at how he's represented. Full lips, broad, flat nose. Clearly a black man. Nubians are black. These are the darkest people. on earth, right, with the jet black skin. This is how they are represented by Egyptians. Very similar to the statue of Amenhotep III, if you guys recall that one. Compare the two, very similar. Now compare it with a pharaoh of foreign origin, Psammetichus II. You can clearly tell this is a pharaoh of foreign origin. The features present on his face are very different from that of the ancient Egyptian. This is a pharaoh of the 26th dynasty, when the native ancient Egyptians stopped ruling themselves. Pay attention to this corner of his head. The hair is represented there, and it seems to be a silky texture. We see the same being represented on the statue of Ptolemy I, an obviously Greek pharaoh. Compare this to Sesostris II. Flat nose, full lips, and the prognatism is back. Pay attention to Psammetichus' mouth. The prognatism is gone, but the head of Sesostris II still has the prognatism and the full lips. This is Sesostris II, pharaoh of the 12th dynasty. All these features point towards the African black male's features. Next, we're going to talk about the Nubians. This picture here is why I've been wanting to take a closer look at the ancient Egyptian iconography, the representations. What do they say? What do they tell? Well, let's take a closer look at how the ancient Egyptians represented themselves compared to how they represented the Nubians. This is often shown when representing the Nubians, the single one picture from the tomb of Seti I, the black-skinned Nubian. But that's not the only representation of the Nubians we find in ancient Egypt. There are so many, and one wall that is very telling is the wall of the tomb of Hui. You can go look it up. Type on Google, tomb of Hui, complete wall. You'll find it. Very easy, quick search. Let's break it down. Let's compare how the ancient Egyptians represented the Nubians and themselves. This wall is very telling. You're gonna be surprised. Let's jump into it. Well, here you can see the typical Nubian that most scholars and most YouTube videos and most media channels and documentaries like to show. These are the Nubians they like to show. The very dark-skinned Nubian, the jet black-skinned ones. But you can tell already, just from this picture alone, that the ancient Egyptians noticed a difference in skin complexion in the Nubians. Very telling, right? That alone should tell you a lot. So again, pay attention. This is a jet black-skinned Nubian. You can see them in Africa today. And this is a dark brown-skinned Nubian. And then if you pay very close attention to this woman here, she's next to a lighter brown skinned woman. This is a Nubian woman. Let's move on to the nobility. This is clearly the nobility. They're wearing more clothes. The fabric seems to be very rich, right? They have pretty much dressed like the ancient Egyptians themselves. But if you pay close attention to the hairstyles, you can tell these are not ancient Egyptians. These are Nubian princes and princesses by most accounts, by every scholar. This is a representation of Nubians offering stuff to, I think, Pharaoh Ramesses I or II. With the princes and princesses, you can already see that the skin tones have changed completely. The ancient Egyptian artists noticed that the skin tones are varied. There are light brown skinned people and very dark brown to jet black. This is an accurate representation of how skin complexion varies in Africa. We are not a monolith whereby everybody has the same dark brown skin. There are very light brown skinned Africans, there are very dark brown skinned Africans, and there are middle brown skinned Africans, right? Like the ones that are a bit chocolatey there, right? And then there are the very jet black skinned Africans, right? They exist, they are there. So again, here the artist noticed those differences. And now let's pay attention to how this princess here is represented. Her skin is on the light brown side shade, as well as that of the priest here next to the jet black skinned man, right? Pay attention now to this Egyptian male, this Egyptian attendant welcoming them in, receiving the gifts. His skin tone is the same as that of the princess here. who is clearly a black Nubian woman bringing gifts to Egyptians, and their features and skin tone are pretty much the same. Let's zoom in. Full lips, prognatism present, right? The face is no longer straight, right? The profile is not straight for the Africans. It's always oblique at the level of the mouth. And when we move on to the Egyptian official, we see the same features being represented, the same prognatism present, the hair texture is the same, the skin tone is the same to that of the priest here. It's pretty telling. We go down here. These are probably Egyptian workers, right? So we have a dark-skinned Egyptian worker next to a cow and another dark-skinned Egyptian worker, but his shade is lighter brown, which tells you that this so-called red-brown skin of the scholars, being a metaphorical representation of working outside, is bogus. For this drawing tells us all about how they viewed the skin tones. It's not metaphorical, it's literal. If an artist is to represent a bunch of black Africans today, they will have to use different shades of brown to represent different people. Again, remember my example, if I am to represent Rihanna, Jay-Z, and Akon, I will not use the same brown. No. Hell no. I'm not using the same dark brown color. No. Rihanna is obviously very light, but Jay-Z is slightly darker than Rihanna, and then Akon is way darker than all of them, but they're all black people. They're all Africans. Very telling. The ancient Egyptians saw that in the Nubians and themselves. The same people, just different skin tones. The world is there for you to see. Go check it out for yourself. The skin tones of the Nubians vary, and the ancient Egyptians portrayed it on their walls. The features represented on the Nubian faces and that of the ancient Egyptian faces are all but the same. They are the same. Of course, some Nubians have a very strong prognatism, which is normal. Not all Africans have a strong prognatism. Some have a very small prognatism. That does not mean they're not African. So, again, this is very telling. Look at the ancient Egyptians represented down here. Right, compare their skin tone to that of the princess and the priest here. Their skin tone is actually darker than that of the princess and the priest. But of course, you can see other Egyptians being represented with a lighter brown shade. But that does not mean they're not black African peoples. And then I will not skip these women. There is a set of yellow-skinned women here. Again, I did not say that ancient Egypt was a full-on black society with no admixture, no foreign type being part of the civilization. No, it's not the case. But what I'm saying is this. The majority population was a black population. Pay attention to these Nubians on the boat here. The skin tones again vary. Here is the so-called red-brown skin. Here is the very jet black skin, dark brown skin. Again, very telling. And remember that the Nubians themselves in their tomb represented themselves with a brown skin tone. Next, another very telling, very telling piece of art from ancient Egypt. This is the wall painting of the temple at Beit El Wali. Beit El Wali. Go look it up. This is Ramesses II conquering Nubians. Let's break it down. Let's analyze. Let's compare the Nubians and the Egyptians. Ramesses II, pay attention to his skin tone, skin color here. Same color they used for his brown horse, they used this for his skin. Now pay attention to the people he is conquering. The skin tone of some of the people he is conquering is the same as the skin tone of the pharaoh himself. Yes, you see Nubians with jet black skin, but you also see Nubians with brown skin. Telling you again that the ancient Egyptians knew the difference, noticed the difference in the complexion of the Nubians. This is very telling, very telling. The skin tone, compare it yourself. The skin tone of the pharaoh is the same as some of the Nubians, right? And it's pretty evenly distributed here. The artists pretty much saw that half of the Nubians had the same skin that ancient Egyptians had, and the other half were darker. Here, the same representation is done again. Brown skin and jet black skin. The ancient Egyptians and the Nubians here are not even different. It's just the hairstyles and what they're wearing. Very telling. The skin tone, the features are pretty much the same on some of the Nubians. Of course, some of them have very different features, right? The prognatism is very, very exaggerated and the lips are fuller. But pay attention down here. Some of the Nubians have a lesser prognatism. Does not matter if they are jet black or brown, it's the same. The brown-skinned Nubians are represented just the same as the ancient Egyptians. Again, we come back to the ancient Egyptian spearmen. These are foot soldiers. Again, the dark brown skin, very similar features. We already talked about this. You take a look yourself and you tell me. These are the 25th dynasty pharaohs. Their features are very telling, and this is ancient Egyptians representing them. But notice on their head, their crown is not the same as that of the pharaohs, right? Some of them, attention to this guy and this guy here, their crown is an ancient Nubian crown, not an Egyptian one, but it is very similar. Again, telling you that the Nubians and the Egyptians were pretty much the same people, right? Sharing the same religion, sharing the same culture, representing themselves in the same way, whether it is in Egypt or in Nubia, right? The wall paintings represent the same people. The skin tones are very similar on ancient Egyptian paintings. And lastly, remember that ancient Egypt considered Nubia its sister civilization. And that's where I'll end. With this evidence, you can clearly see that the scholars' view on the ancient Egyptians being a Middle Eastern, North African race does not stand. The features represented on ancient Egyptian statues are very similar to that of the Black Nubians. The features present on the statues are very similar to that of the Africans further south. This evidence proves it. To sum up, though many modern scholars believe that the ancient Egyptians were a North African people, therefore closely resembling Middle Eastern peoples and not Black Africans. However, they fail to address the striking differences in representations of Mediterranean peoples and Middle Eastern peoples with ancient Egyptian representations of themselves. Those differences being particularly found in the facial features as well as hair texture and skin tone as well. And inversely, the scholars fail to provide an explanation as to why Nubians and other West African representations have so many undeniable similarities with the ancient Egyptian statues and paintings. This is again another failure of modern Egyptology to accept the simple fact that ancient Egyptians were a majority black population from its foundation to the loss of its independence. This interpretation of the iconography of ancient Egypt becomes all the more plausible and even undeniable when you pair it with what the ancient Greek scholars said about the Egyptian population of the time, which is what we're going to look at in our next video. Stay tuned. Peace.